Kang Jiseok, the legendary Iron Stone of Shin-Hwa City's criminal underworld, has lived 20 years believing that family is a liability he successfully eliminated. His cold world is shattered when he is summoned to the deathbed of the only woman he ever loved, who leaves him with a dying wish: protect the daughter he abandoned. Enter Han Sora, a fierce, community-driven social worker who views Jiseok as a monster rather than a father. Instead of a typical reunion, Jiseok finds himself forced to shadow Sora in the city's poorest districts to keep her safe from his own rising enemies. Their clashing ideologies turn into a battle of wills, reaching a breaking point when Jiseok's second-in-command orchestrates a coup. In a climactic warehouse fire, Jiseok must decide between his multi-billion-dollar vault and the daughter who finally gave him a soul, ultimately choosing to let his empire burn to fulfill a promise 20 years in the making. The next morning, the sun rose over Shin-Hwa City, but the light couldn't pierce the thick tension hanging over the slums. Kang Jiseok did not like to be told no. He spent his life making people disappear for less than what Sora had done the night before. Yet, here he was, sitting in his armored car outside her crumbling apartment building, watching the front door. "Sir, the penthouse is ready," his assistant whispered from the front seat. "We can have our men move her belongings in an hour, whether she likes it or not." Jiseok looked at the tattered photo in his hand. "She isn't a package to be delivered," he growled. "She has her mother's stubbornness. Force will only make her hate me more." Just then, Sora stepped out onto the sidewalk. She was carrying a heavy box of supplies for the community center. Jiseok stepped out of the car, his presence instantly silencing the noisy street. People ducked into doorways, recognizing the Iron Stone. "I told you to leave," Sora said without looking up. She tried to walk past him, but Jiseok stepped into her path. "That apartment has bulletproof glass and a private chef," Jiseok said, his voice like grinding stones. "Here, you have a lock that can be picked with a paperclip. My enemies are already looking for you, Sora. This isn't a game." He signaled to his guards. Two men in black suits stepped forward, reaching for her box. "Let us take that, Miss Han. We have a car waiting to take you to your new home." Sora pulled the box away, her knuckles white. She looked at the guards, then at the shiny black cars blocking the narrow street. "Your new home is a prison with a fancy view," she snapped. She reached into her bag and pulled out a handful of crumpled bills, her meager savings. She threw them at Jiseok's chest. "Here is the rent for the sidewalk you're blocking," she hissed. "I don't want your money. I don't want your guards standing outside my door like statues. If you want to protect me, then stay away from me. You are the only danger in my life." Jiseok watched the money flutter to the ground. He was a man who moved millions with a single phone call, yet he stood there, speechless, as a girl in a worn-out hoodie walked away from him. His guards looked at him, waiting for the order to grab her, but Jiseok simply raised a hand to stop them. For the first time in 20 years, the Iron Stone felt a crack. He realized he couldn't buy her safety, and he certainly couldn't buy her love. He watched her disappear into the crowded market, realizing that if he wanted to keep his promise to a dying woman, he would have to learn to fight a war he didn't understand. Kang Jiseok did something he hadn't done in decades: he walked. He left his armored car and his guards behind, pulling a dark cap low over his eyes to hide his famous face. He followed Sora from a distance, watching her move through the deepest parts of the Shin-Hwa slums. This was a place where even the police were afraid to go, but Sora walked through it like she owned the streets. He watched her enter a building that looked like it was held together by hope and duct tape. From the shadows of an alleyway, Jiseok looked through a broken window. Inside, Sora wasn't hiding or resting. She was surrounded by a dozen hungry children and elderly people who had been forgotten by the city. She wasn't using a gun or a pile of money to get respect. Instead, she used her voice. She spent hours arguing with a landlord to turn the heat back on. She sat on the floor and bandaged. A young boy scraped knee. She even shared her own small lunch with a woman who looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Jiseok felt a strange tightening in his chest. In his world, strength meant how many people you could frighten. He thought he was the most powerful man in the city because he had an army. But as he watched Sora, he saw a different kind of power. She had no bodyguards, no weapons, and no wealth, yet people looked at her with a love that he would never know. When a group of local thugs tried to intimidate an old man near the entrance, Sora didn't run. She stepped right between them, her eyes flashing with a fire that reminded Jiseok of the woman he had abandoned. She spoke with such courage that the thugs actually backed down, looking embarrassed. She has the heart of a lion, Jiseok whispered to himself. He realized then that he had spent his whole life pretending to be strong by building walls of iron and stone. But Sora lived without walls. She faced the world's cruelty every single day and chose to be kind anyway. That was a strength Jiseok didn't have. He was a billionaire, but standing in that dusty alley, watching his daughter save a community with nothing but her bare hands, he felt like the poorest man in Shin-Hwa City. For the first time, he didn't just want to protect her because of a promise. He wanted to protect her because the world needed people like her. But as he turned to leave, he spotted a black van with tinted windows idling at the corner. His heart sank. His enemies weren't watching him, they were watching her. The black van at the corner didn't belong to the neighborhood. In the slums of Shin-Hwa City, vehicles were usually dented and rusted, but this one was polished to a mirror shine. Jiseok knew that look. It was the look of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His blood ran cold as he realized his secret was out. The iron stone was no longer untouchable because he finally had something to lose. Inside a dimly lit warehouse across town, Jiseok's greatest rival, a man named Viper, stared at a grainy photo of Sora. He laughed, a sound like dry leaves rubbing together. So, the legend actually has a heart, Viper hissed to his men. He spent 20 years pretending he was made of stone, but he was just hiding a treasure in the gutter. If we take the girl, we take the man. Unaware of the eyes on her, Sora walked home as the sun began to set. Jiseok followed her from the shadows, his hand resting on the pistol hidden beneath his coat. He saw the black van begin to crawl forward, its engine purring like a hungry beast. The back door slid open just an inch, revealing the glint of a weapon. Jiseok didn't think so. He didn't care about his reputation or his secret. He stepped out from the darkness of an alley just as Sora reached her front gate. Sora! Get down, he roared. The street exploded into chaos. A burst of gunfire shattered the windows of a nearby shop. Sora screamed and dove behind a concrete planter as bullets kicked up dust around her. Jiseok sprinted toward her, firing back at the van with deadly accuracy. He wasn't just a businessman anymore, he was the monster the city feared, and he was fighting for the only thing that mattered. The van sped off, tires screeching, as Jiseok's own security team arrived in a cloud of smoke and noise. Jiseok reached Sora and grabbed her shoulders, checking her for injuries. His hands, which had never shaken in a boardroom, were trembling. I told you. Jiseok shouted, his voice thick with fear and anger. I told you they would come for you because of me. Sora pushed his hands away, her face pale but her eyes still full of fire. She looked at the bullet holes in the wall, then back at the man who had just saved her. For the first time, she saw the true cost of his world. She wasn't just a social worker anymore, she was a target. They didn't come for me because I'm your daughter, she whispered, her voice shaking. They came for me because you're a killer, and they want to hurt you. My life is the price of your sins. Jiseok stood in the middle of the street as the neighborhood watched in terror. He realized Viper wouldn't stop until Sora was dead or captured. The blood was in the water, and the sharks were circling. He had to do something he never thought he'd do. He had to bring the mistake into the heart of his empire to keep her alive. The headquarters of the Ironstone Syndicate was a tower of glass and cold ambition. For Sora, walking through the lobby was like entering the belly of a beast. She was flanked by 4 massive guards, but she didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a storm about to break. Jiseok had forced her here for safety, locking her in a luxury suite, but he had forgotten that Sora wasn't the type to stay where she was put. On the top floor, Jiseok sat at the head of a long marble table. 12 of the most dangerous men in Shin-Hwa City sat before him, discussing shipping routes and protection money. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cigars and the weight of dark secrets. Our profits in the north are down, one of the lieutenants said, his voice cold. We need to remind the local shopkeepers who own the streets. A few fires should. The heavy oak door swung open with a bang. Every man in the room reached for the weapon hidden beneath his suit, but they froze when they saw Sora. She marched straight to the head of the table, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. She looked tiny compared to the stone-faced criminals, but her presence was a physical force. Is this what you do? Sora demanded, slamming a handful of photos onto the table. They weren't photos of money or maps. They were pictures of the neighborhood children she had helped that morning. You sit in your silk suits and talk about burning down shops while these people are starving? Jiseok felt a cold sweat on his neck. Sora, go back to your room. This is not the place. No, she shouted, pointing at the lieutenant who had suggested the fires. This man wants to burn a grocery store. That store is the only reason an 80-year-old woman in my neighborhood has food. Are you a leader, Jiseok, or are you just the king of bullies? The room went deathly silent. No one had ever spoken to the Ironstone like that. The lieutenants looked at each other, their faces filled with shock and hidden smiles. Jiseok, the man who terrified the city, was being lectured by a girl in a faded hoodie. His authority was melting away in front of his men. You call this an empire? Sora continued, her voice trembling with righteous anger. It's a graveyard. You're all just ghosts living in a big, expensive box. She turned and walked out, leaving the doors wide open. Jiseok sat in the silence, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at his men, and for the first time, he felt ashamed of the power they shared. Sora hadn't just embarrassed him, she had held up a mirror, and he didn't like the monster looking back. Later that night, the glass tower felt less like a palace and more like a tomb. Jiseok found Sora on the balcony, staring out at the flickering lights of Shin-Hwa City. She didn't turn around when he stepped out. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the echoes of her angry words. From the boardroom. You think I enjoyed it, Jiseok said softly. His voice didn't have its usual iron edge. You think I walked away because I wanted a life of gold and silk. Sora finally looked at him, her eyes red from crying. You left a woman who loved you. You left a child you didn't even know. What other reason is there besides greed? Jiseok leaned against the railing, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, he looked his age. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. It was yellowed with age, the edges frayed from being touched 1,000 times. Inside was a single letter, written in a shaky hand. When I was young, I was a soldier for a man much worse than me, Jiseok whispered. I was ambitious, yes. But then your mother got pregnant. The boss found out. He told me that a man with a family is a man with a target on his back. He gave me a choice, leave and never look back, or stay and watch both of you be used as leverage against me. Sora's breath hitched. So you just gave up? I thought I was saving you, Jiseok said, his voice cracking. I believed that if I stayed away, you would be invisible. I thought the Iron Stone had to be alone to keep his enemies at bay. I sent money through secret accounts for years, hoping it was enough to keep the heat on and the table full. But I was a coward, Sora. I chose to be a ghost because I was too afraid to be a target. He looked at the tattered photo of the young girl again. Every time I ordered a hit or stole a business, I told myself I was doing it to build a world where you'd never have to worry. But all I did was build a wall so high I couldn't see over it. I missed your first steps. I missed your mother's final years. I traded the only real thing I had for a throne made of salt. Sora looked at the man she had called a monster. For the first time, she didn't see a mafia boss. She saw a lonely, broken man who had lived 20 years in a prison of his own making. The Iron Stone was finally starting to crumble, revealing the grieving father underneath. The fragile peace between Jiseok and Sora didn't last long. The shadows inside the Iron Stone Syndicate were moving. Sang-hoon, Jiseok's second-in-command, had spent years waiting for a moment of weakness. He had watched Jiseok soften, watched him cry over an old photo, and decided that the Iron Stone had finally turned into dust. To Sang-hoon, a boss with a heart was a boss who needed to be replaced. The trap was set with a simple lie. Sang-hoon rushed into Jiseok's office, looking panicked. Sir. It's Viper. His men have found the community center. They're tearing it apart looking for Sora's friends. Sora, who was standing nearby, didn't wait to hear the rest. She bolted for the door, her only thought being the children she protected every day. Jiseok roared for his guards, but the hallway was strangely empty. He realized too late that something was wrong, but he couldn't let Sora go alone. He chased her into the parking garage and forced her into his car, racing toward a remote industrial district on the edge of Shin-Hwa City. They arrived at a massive, rusted warehouse. The silence was the first warning. There were no children, no crying, and no sign of Viper's men. There was only the sound of their own footsteps, echoing against the high metal walls. Sora, get behind me, Jiseok whispered, pulling his weapon. Suddenly, the heavy steel doors slammed shut, locking them inside. High above on a metal catwalk, a light flickered on. Sang-hoon stood there, looking down at them with a cold, mocking smile. Beside him stood a dozen armed men who used to take orders from Jiseok. You really have changed, Jiseok, Sang-hoon shouted, his voice bouncing off the walls. The old Iron Stone would have smelled a rat miles away. But you were too busy playing daddy to notice your own men turning against you. I gave you everything, Sang-hoon. Jiseok yelled, shielding Sora with his body. You gave me a boss who went soft, Sang-hoon snapped. The syndicate needs a leader who loves power, not a girl from the slums. Today, the Iron Stone Empire ends. And the best part? I'm going to let you watch your legacy burn before I finish you both. Sang-hoon signaled to his men, and they began to pour gasoline from the catwalks. The smell was overpowering. Sora gripped Jiseok's arm, her eyes wide with terror. Jiseok looked around at the locked exits and the barrels of fuel. He realized this wasn't just a hit, it was a funeral. Sang-hoon tossed a single lit match, and the floor erupted into a sea of orange flames. The coup was complete, and Jiseok was trapped in a hell of his own making. The warehouse transformed into a roaring furnace in seconds. The heat was a physical weight, pressing against Jiseok's lungs and singing his skin. Thick, oily smoke spiraled toward the Sealing, turning the air into a gray poison. Sang-hoon and his traders had vanished into the safety of the night, leaving behind a world of orange light and screaming metal. Sora! Jiseok roared, shielding his eyes from the glare. Through a curtain of dancing flames, he saw her. She was trapped on the south side of the warehouse, pinned behind a mountain of fallen wooden crates that had ignited like giant matches. She was coughing violently, her small frame shrinking away from the heat. Between them lay a literal river of fire where the gasoline had pooled. But as Jiseok moved toward her, a massive explosion rocked the north wall. A hidden vault, built into the very foundation of the warehouse, groaned and swung open from the force of the blast. Inside sat the heart of Jiseok's life's work. There were stacks of gold bars, millions in untraceable cash, and the original deeds to every building and dock he owned in Shin-Hwa City. It was the physical proof of his power, the legacy he had sacrificed everything to build. The fire was moving fast. The heavy steel beams above the vault were beginning to glow red. Ready to collapse and bury his fortune forever. If he ran left, he could save the briefcase containing the codes to his offshore accounts, ensuring he remained the richest man in the city. If he ran right, he would have to leap through a wall of flame to reach the daughter who still hadn't forgiven him. The money, Jiseok, he heard Sang-hoon's voice echoing in his head. Choose your empire. For a heartbeat, the iron stone stood frozen. He looked at the gold, the glittering prize that had cost him 20 years of happiness. Then he looked at Sora. She had stopped coughing and was simply looking at him through the smoke. Her eyes weren't full of anger anymore, they were full of a quiet, sad realization. She expected him to choose the gold. She expected him to be the monster he had always been. Daddy, she gasped, her voice barely a whisper over the roar of the blaze. The word hit Jiseok harder than any bullet ever had. The vault didn't matter. The city didn't matter. The ironstone died in that moment, replaced by a man who finally understood what it meant to be rich. I'm coming, Sora. Jiseok screamed. He didn't look at the gold again. He turned his back on his billions and sprinted directly into the heart of the Inferno. The heat was so intense it felt like the air itself was turning into liquid glass. Jiseok didn't hesitate. He ran past the open vault, ignoring the glint of gold and the smell of burning money. The billions he had spent a lifetime gathering were now nothing more than heavy rocks. Behind him, the ceiling above the vault groaned and gave way, burying his entire fortune under tons of twisted steel and stone. The empire was gone, but Jiseok didn't even look back. Sora! Hold your breath, he screamed. He reached the wall of fire that separated them. With a roar of pure desperation, he threw his expensive wool coat over his head and leaped through the curtain of flames. The fire licked at his skin, but he didn't stop until he reached her. Sora was curled into a small ball, her face pale and covered in soot. I've got you, Jiseok whispered, pulling her into his arms. The warehouse was beginning to fall apart. Large wooden beams, fully ablaze, tumbled from the roof like falling stars. Jiseok knew they couldn't just run out the way they came, the path was blocked by a lake of burning fuel. He saw a small loading door at the far end of the building, but it was at least 50 feet away through a rain of fire. Jiseok tucked Sora's head against his chest, shielding her entire body with his own. He arched his back, creating a human shell to protect her from the falling embers and the blistering heat. Every step was agony. He felt the fire singe his hair and melt the fabric of his shirt against his back, but he didn't let go. Why? Sora sobbed into his chest, her voice muffled by the roar of the blaze. Why didn't you take the money? Because the money can't call me daddy, Jiseok gasped, his voice raspy from the smoke. A massive beam cracked above them, falling straight toward Sora. Without thinking, Jiseok lunged forward, letting the heavy timber strike his shoulder instead of her. He stumbled, the pain blinding him for a moment, but he forced his legs to keep moving. He was no longer the iron stone because of his cruelty, he was iron because he refused to break until his daughter was safe. With one final, desperate surge of strength, Jiseok kicked open the small loading door. They tumbled out into the cool, wet grass of the shipyard just as the entire warehouse collapsed. Behind them in a mountain of sparks and ash, Jiseok lay on the ground, gasping for the night air, his back scorched and his strength gone. Sora sat up, shaking but unharmed. She looked at the ruin of the warehouse, then at her father, who was covered in burns and dirt. For the first time, she didn't see a boss or a monster. She saw a man who had burned down the world just to hold her hand. She reached out and took his hand, and for the first time in 20 years, Jiseok felt like he had finally won. 1 year later, the name Iron Stone had become a ghost story in the dark corners of Shin-Hwa City. The skyscrapers still glowed with neon, and the docks were still busy, but the man who once ruled them was nowhere to be found. Some said he had died in the Great Warehouse Fire, while others whispered that he had fled the country. They were all wrong. In a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city, far away from the glass towers and the violence, a small community center had a new coat of paint. Inside, a man with deep scars on his arms and back was busy fixing a broken wooden chair. He wore a simple flannel shirt and a smile that reached his eyes, a look that the old Kang Jiseok wouldn't have recognized in a mirror. "The kids are hungry, and the delivery truck is late again," Sora said, walking into the workshop. She looked at the chair and laughed. "You're getting better at that, you know. It actually looks like a chair now." Jiseok wiped the sweat from his forehead with a rag. "It's harder than running a syndicate," he joked, standing up. "Wood doesn't follow orders as well as henchmen do." He had given everything away. The remaining legal businesses were sold to fund hospitals and schools in the slums Sora loved. The illegal ones were dismantled, their secrets handed over to the authorities by a mysterious anonymous source. Jiseok was no longer a king, but for the first time in his life, he could sleep without a gun under his pillow. Sora walked over and handed him a bottle of water. They stood together in the doorway, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. It was the same color as the flames that had nearly taken them, but now, it felt peaceful. "My mother would have been happy to see this," Sora said quietly. "She always told me that even the hardest stone can be shaped into something beautiful if you have enough patience." Jiseok looked at his daughter. She had spent a year teaching him how to be a person again. She had shown him that power wasn't about fear, but about how much you could give to those who had nothing. She had saved his life in that warehouse, but she had saved his soul in the months that followed. "She was right," Jiseok replied. He reached out and awkwardly patted her shoulder, a gesture that was becoming more natural every day. "I spent 20 years building a throne of salt. I'm glad it washed away." As the evening chill set in, Sora turned to head back inside to help with the community dinner. She paused at the door and looked back over her shoulder. "Coming, father?" The word hung in the air, sweet and heavy. It was the first time she had said it without any sadness or anger in her voice. Jiseok felt a warmth in his chest that no amount of gold could ever buy. He dropped his tools and followed her, leaving the iron stone behind in the dust. The mistake had indeed changed everything. She had given a ruthless man a reason to finally come home.